The story of Demet Özdemir and Can Yaman is one that continues to echo in the hearts of fans around the world. For years, people have followed their journey with fascination, from the dazzling chemistry they shared on screen to the quiet, private moments that slipped through into the public eye. But behind the red carpets, the interviews, and the endless speculation, there was a reality much more fragile: two people caught between love, fame, and the inevitable weight of expectations. Demet herself once confessed that some memories from those days are so vivid that they return in flashes, as if they happened just yesterday. And among those memories, one stands apart, painful and unforgettable: the last time he held her hand. She remembers the warmth of his touch, the firmness of his grasp, and the silence that surrounded them in that moment. It wasn't just the silence of a room, but the silence of two souls knowing what was about to end. Demet, always graceful and composed in the public eye, felt her chest tighten as if time itself had slowed down. Can's hand was strong, familiar, but his eyes betrayed a storm of emotions he could no longer hide. They didn't need words, everything was said in that simple gesture. For fans, their story was a fairy tale, full of passion and hope. But for Demet, that night carried the weight of reality. She knew that when he let go, it wouldn't be just the end of a moment, it would be the end of an entire chapter in her life. That realization carved itself into her heart. "He held my hand," she later admitted in an interview, "and I knew it was the last time. I wanted to freeze that moment forever, but life doesn't stop for anyone." The room where it happened was dimly lit, quiet, almost too still. Outside, the city was alive, cars rushing by, people laughing, life moving forward. But inside, their world stood still. Demet's fingers trembled slightly, not because of fear, but because of the certainty of loss. Can, despite his strong exterior, had tears welling up in his eyes, though he tried to hide them. He wasn't just letting go of her hand, he was letting go of promises, shared dreams, and the unspoken bond that had once seemed unbreakable. For Demet, the memory is haunting because it wasn't loud. There were no fights, no dramatic words shouted across the room. Just silence, a touch, and the ache of knowing it would never be the same again. And perhaps that is what makes it so unforgettable, because endings don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come quietly, softly, slipping through your fingers like sand, leaving you to wonder if you could have done something to hold on a little longer. To truly understand why that handhold became such a defining moment for Demet, we have to step back into the whirlwind that surrounded both of them at the height of their fame. After Erkenci Kush turned into a worldwide sensation, Demet and Can were no longer just two actors, they became symbols of love and desire, idealized by millions of fans who believed their on-screen romance must also be real behind the cameras. The truth, however, was far more complicated. Fame is intoxicating, but it is also merciless. For Can, every public move was dissected, every smile interpreted, every silence turned into headlines. For Demet, the pressure was equally heavy. She was constantly asked about him, about them, about whether what the world saw on screen was reality. The constant intrusion left them with little room to breathe. What was supposed to be their private journey turned into a public spectacle, where even the smallest gesture was magnified and twisted into a narrative they couldn't control. Demet later admitted that it wasn't one single fight or one single betrayal that marked the beginning of the end. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of explaining themselves, of hiding their most fragile feelings, of trying to protect something delicate while the whole world was watching. She once said, "It's hard to hold on to love when everyone feels entitled to a piece of it." And that exhaustion eventually brought them to a crossroads where they both realized something painful: they loved each other, but maybe love wasn't enough to withstand everything. The night of that final touch came after hours of conversation that went in circles. They sat across from each other, the weight of unspoken truths filling the air. Can, with his characteristic intensity, wanted to fight for them, but deep down, he too recognized how much had already been lost. Demet, more gentle but no less strong, tried to explain what she felt, how the pressure had stolen the joy, how she couldn't find herself anymore in a relationship that was once her safe place. When their voices grew tired, silence took over. They looked at each other with a kind of sadness that words could never carry. And then it happened, his hand reached across the table, instinctively finding hers. The moment their skin touched, Demet felt the flood of every memory, their first laughter together on set, the secret glances in crowded rooms, the warmth of being understood without words. And yet, beneath all of that, she felt the truth pressing down on her chest. This was not a beginning. It was a goodbye disguised as a caress. She didn't pull away, though part of her wanted to, because pulling away would have made it final too quickly. Instead, she let the seconds stretch, memorizing the feel of his fingers intertwined with hers. Can's grip was firm, almost desperate, as if he too wanted to stop the clock. But the heaviness in their eyes betrayed the truth neither of them could deny anymore. Demet would later reflect that what made it so painful was not the act itself, but the knowledge it carried. "I knew it was the last time," she whispered in one interview years later, her voice trembling. "And in that knowing, I felt my heart break, not because I didn't love him, but because sometimes, even love cannot save you." For fans, who saw only the glamour and the passion, this was unimaginable. How could two people who seemed destined for each other walk away? But for Demet, that handhold remains one of the most honest experiences of her life, a moment where nothing was hidden, no cameras, no expectations, no performance. Just two people, two hearts, acknowledging both the love they had shared and the impossibility of carrying it forward. That's why it still echoes in her memory, sharper than any headline, louder than any rumor. Because in the quiet grip of his hand, she lost not only a man she loved but also the future she once believed in. After that night, Demet carried the memory of his hand in hers like a shadow she could never quite shake. She walked out of the room knowing a chapter had closed, but the ache inside her didn't let her sleep for nights. Even in the quiet of her own apartment, when the lights were off and the city outside had gone still, she could still feel it, the warmth of his skin, the finality of his grip, and the silence that had sealed their fate. In interviews later, Demet would often be asked why she looked so melancholic in certain moments, why her laughter sometimes seemed forced, why her eyes betrayed a sadness even when she smiled. The truth was simple: she had lost not just a partner, but the only person who had truly seen her beyond the image of the actress, beyond the fame. Can had known her heart in ways no one else did. He knew her fears, her insecurities, her little habits. Losing that connection left her feeling exposed, like the world could see her but no one could know her anymore. Her friends described that period as one of silence. Demet stopped going out as much, stopped letting people close. She immersed herself in work, as many do when they don't want to confront the emptiness left behind. On set, she was still radiant, still professional, still delivering performances that won her praise. But behind the scenes, she was fragile, careful not to let her heart wander too far, careful not to let her emotions spill where they couldn't be controlled. And yet, the strangest thing was how one memory could haunt her so vividly. The feel of his hand became both her comfort and her torment. In moments of loneliness, she would close her eyes and remember it, not because she wanted to torture herself, but because holding on to that last touch made her feel closer to him, even in absence. It was a cruel irony: the very thing that symbolized the end was also the thing she used to keep him alive in her heart. She once said in a private conversation with a close friend, later leaked to the press, "It wasn't the goodbye that broke me, it was knowing that he was still there, alive, breathing, but not mine anymore." That distinction, between losing someone to fate and losing someone by choice, made the pain sharper. Because every time she saw him in magazines, on TV, or even in passing through mutual friends, she was reminded that their separation wasn't caused by death or distance, but by life itself, two people who loved each other but couldn't survive together. In the months that followed, Can too seemed restless. Rumors connected him to different women, whispers of new romances filled tabloids, but those who knew him closely claimed his eyes still carried a sadness whenever Demet's name was mentioned. Both of them were haunted, but neither dared to reach out. Perhaps pride held them back, perhaps fear of reopening wounds, or perhaps the acceptance that some endings, no matter how painful, must remain untouched. Still, Demet couldn't escape the flashbacks. At award shows, when she would walk across the stage and hear applause, she sometimes remembered the sound of silence from that last night instead. When she saw couples holding hands in the street, she felt her chest tighten, recalling how it felt to know the difference between a touch that promised forever and a touch that whispered goodbye. For fans, she remained a symbol of strength and grace. But for Demet, every smile was a choice, every step forward an act of courage. And the memory of that final handhold became her quiet companion, a reminder that love, no matter how deep, sometimes leaves you standing alone in the aftermath. Years later, when the storm of speculation had quieted and both Demet and Can had gone on to pursue different paths, the memory of that final handhold still lingered like a ghost neither of them could escape. For Demet, it became one of those experiences that shaped the way she understood love, loss, and the fragility of human connection. When asked in an emotional interview about the hardest moment in her personal life, she didn't hesitate. Her eyes lowered, her voice softened, and she said, "He held my hand, and I knew it was the last time." The words struck like lightning through her fans. Those who had followed her journey felt the weight behind that confession. It wasn't just a memory, it was a wound that had never fully healed. Viewers could see it in her eyes as she spoke, the way they glistened with unfallen tears, the way her hands trembled slightly as if her body remembered the sensation of that night. Demet was not just telling a story. She was reliving it, right there, in front of everyone. The world immediately wanted to know, had Can heard these words? The answer came indirectly. Though he never gave a direct statement, during a promotional event in Italy, someone from the audience shouted her name. Can froze for a split second, his smile faltered, and his eyes seemed to glaze over with the kind of ache you can't fake. The cameras caught it, the flicker of emotion that betrayed how deeply her memory still lived within him. He quickly moved on, regaining his composure, but those who watched closely knew, her words had reached him, even if no reply ever came. For Demet, sharing the story was not about reopening old wounds but about honoring the truth. She explained later that silence can eat away at you more than pain itself. "I carried that night with me for years," she said, "and speaking about it was the only way I could breathe again. It wasn't to hurt him, or to remind anyone of what was lost. It was to free myself from the weight of it." The irony was that her honesty only deepened the public's fascination. Headlines exploded across Turkey and beyond. Demet Özdemir finally speaks about her last night with Can Yaman, the emotional confession that shook millions. Social media lit up with fans dissecting every word, replaying the video of her interview, slowing down the frames to analyze her expressions. And while some celebrated her courage, others speculated endlessly about whether her words were meant as a secret message to Can. Behind the noise, though, the reality remained more intimate. For Demet, the memory was not just a headline but a scar, one that taught her about resilience. She admitted that for a long time, she avoided even the thought of holding someone's hand again. Simple gestures that once felt natural now carried too much weight. Every time someone reached for her, she would hesitate, remembering how one handhold had changed everything. And for Can, though he rarely spoke openly, those who were close to him noticed the changes. He had become more guarded, more careful with his emotions in public. The man who once carried himself with unshakable confidence now seemed to have walls built around his heart. A close friend of his once hinted, he never fully got over her. That moment, the way it ended, it stayed with him. Even if he doesn't say it, we all know. The truth is, both of them carried that night in silence, in different ways. For Demet, it was a memory she eventually chose to share, to heal. For Can, it was a memory he chose to bury, to protect. But whether spoken or hidden, the weight of that last handhold remained carved into their lives, shaping the way they loved, the way they trusted, the way they moved forward. And so, when Demet finally said those words aloud, she wasn't just recalling a personal story, she was admitting to the world that sometimes, the most powerful goodbyes are not loud or dramatic. Sometimes, they are quiet, tender, disguised as something simple, like a hand reaching for yours, holding it for just a moment, before letting go forever. In the end, that simple gesture, his hand holding hers for the last time, became the moment that defined everything. For Demet, it was not just the closing of a relationship but the loss of a piece of herself she could never fully reclaim. For Can, it was a silent confession he could never put into words. Years passed, projects came and went, fame continued to follow them both, but the memory of that night never faded. It wasn't about regret or anger, it was about love that had been real, but not strong enough to survive the weight of the world around it. Demet once summed it up in a single sentence that still echoes today: sometimes the loudest goodbyes are the ones said without a word. And for millions who followed their story, that truth resonated deeply. Because in that final touch, in that final silence, they left behind not just each other, but a reminder that love, even when it ends, can leave a mark that never disappears.